Welcome to 10 for 10, the podcast that delves into 10 modern Israel concepts, each for about 10 minutes. We are Dr. Tal Grinfas David and Dr. Jonathan Golden. In today's episode, we'll ask whether the mass protest movements we have seen in Israel in the last 2 years are indicative of a democracy in action or a state in crisis. Tal, what have you noticed about recent protests compared to past protests?
Well, recent protests feel different from the many protest movements of the past, and Israel has a rich and long history of those as a democracy that secures the freedom to peacefully demonstrate and protest without fear of reprisal. You can see the guide for a link to my conversation with Dr. Doron Schulzener about the history of Israel's protests. In the last 2 years, there have been two major waves of protests. One wave from February 2023 to October 7th of 2023, which were for and against judicial reform, and a second wave since the Hamas attack to the present day over negotiations for hostages, perceived corruption among government representatives, and the government's slow response to act on behalf of its citizens in effective ways during this war. One of the main differences, I think, from past protest movements is the sheer number of participants, which is staggering. Over 20% of Israelis self-reported participating in at least one protest. And there were protests with 300,000, 500,000 people a night, sometimes several nights in a row, sometimes weekend after weekend. This is especially high when considering that there are elderly and children who cannot participate, and that at any moment there may be a barrage of rockets overhead. It's even high compared to other countries' protest movements. So are these protests a moment of crisis or democracy as usual? Well, Israel's enemies have interpreted the ongoing protests as a sign of weakness, an opportunity to launch an unprecedented attack on civilians, and to continuously weaken society's resilience with a war of attrition in the hopes of ending the state. But I would challenge that notion. External threats tend to galvanize the Israeli public to unite in many ways. The question is whether the government can display that same spirit of unity to tackle some of the biggest challenges facing the state, and whether the acrimony in politics can be replaced with statism, mamlachtiyut, as we described it in episode 1, which includes moral clarity, service for the people without partisanship or self-gain, and a clear common vision for the future of the nation. Jonathan, what have you noticed about these recent protests?
Well, I noticed that many protesters went to the streets because they felt an attack from within on democratic institutions that they wanted to protect. The judicial protest centered on the mamlachtiyut idea, as you said, that we discussed together in our first episode. Did government institutions like the Supreme Court have the collective interest and the preservation of democratic principles and ideals in mind? The current government questions how representative the court is of the will of the people. The courts, charged with upholding the law and staying true to Israel's founding documents and democratic principles, have been attacked as not representing the people, as they were not directly elected for that role. That has led to a questioning of the selection process of the judges, as some leaders did not see themselves in the judges on the court. It led to the bigger question about balancing Judaism and democracy in a Jewish democratic state. Tension that remain unresolved. Does judicial reform represent simply a power grab, or is it a needed rebalancing of the powers of democratic institutions? It is perilous to make major rash decisions in a time of war and crisis.
Yeah, I agree that wartime is not the best opportunity for making constitutional-like decisions about the future character of the state. Is it a crisis or a democracy in the making that we are witnessing? It is important to remember that Israel is young, unfinished in many respects, and is still living the gray areas of systems that it inherited from the British Mandate and even back to the Ottoman Empire. The Declaration of Independence called for a constitution to be crafted by October 1st, 1948. But Ben-Gurion reasoned that the future for the ingathering of the many exiles who would immigrate to Israel could not be determined by the small existing population, and that the Tanakh already served as Israel's Jewish constitution. The result of not having a state constitution is that the Knesset and the courts are legislating the constitution in chapters slowly, and key areas remain unresolved, such as you said, the balance of powers between the judicial, legislative, and executive bodies, and the balance between the Jewish character of the state and its democratic principles when these come into conflict. This unresolved gap may be a catalyst for the prolonged protests we are seeing today as people try to shape the future of the country they love. Jonathan, how would you compare the issues that people are protesting about more recently in comparison to previous protest movements, such as Women of the Wall, who protested for the rights of women to be able to pray with equality at the Kotel, or, for example, pro-LGBTQ rights and marches?
I see this moment of protest as both normal, but also extraordinary. Any democracy has moments of protest, particularly when a segment of society feels that it is not being treated equally under the law or receiving its fair share of social benefits. But for me, what makes the current protest movement so extraordinary is its length, its scale, and most importantly, the diverse backgrounds of those who are protesting in common cause. And for you, Tal, where do you see the disconnect between the government and the people in major protests of recent times post-October 7th?
Yeah, well, as the war has continued, there has been a heavy toll on those who have served in the IDF, both regulars and reservists. Some have fought for over a year, unable to keep jobs, support families, or celebrate key moments with loved ones. Many of these people have not received adequate funding or support from the government for their own mental and physical health needs, for protection of their income, or for their family's needs. Meanwhile, they see that segments of Israeli society who refuse to serve and share in the burden continue to receive government funding, despite the ruling of the Supreme Court that it is inherently undemocratic and unequal. And this is prevalent, of course, in the ultra-Orthodox community, a remnant, I guess, of the 1947 status quo agreement between Ben-Gurion and Agudas Yisrael, which exempted the Orthodox community from serving. Government ministers representing these segments of society today have actively asked their citizens to throw away to the garbage or flush down the toilet IDF mobilization orders, while looking for loopholes to ensure future funding of their housing, yeshiva studies, and general lifestyle. So it is an example of the leaders acting out of political self-preservation and partisanship for their sector instead of in the collective interest of the nation weary from war. Of course, they believe that their studies and prayers are what keep the nation safe, which raises the question, what does it look like when all citizens are called upon to sacrifice for the country's defense? According to recent polling, the vast majority of Israeli citizens believe that all capable citizens should serve in the IDF. So this politically right-wing government appears pretty disconnected from the needs and desires of the public when it acts to appease these ministers just to maintain the coalition. A healthy, well-functioning state should be able to care for the citizens who serve in its defense. So how this government ultimately handles IDF conscription and funding of serving citizens' needs will determine whether the state approaches a crisis point or whether it adopts a democratic compromise to alleviate the stress on individuals and families. You know, what could a crisis look like? Well, several days of disruption, like people in masses protesting against the government instead of going to their jobs, which would harm the Israeli economy. Mass arrests of those who ignore conscription orders, filling up our jails and straining the police force. Units of elite pilots and tank commanders threatening to abort missions that are necessary for Israel's defense. You know, these are possible escalations, but no one wins in this scenario. So hopefully an agreement will be reached soon. Meanwhile, what's remarkable is that the nonprofit sector, volunteers, are filling the void to meet some of these dire needs, such as help for single mothers widowed by the war, cleaning out homes in the north to allow citizens to return until such a time as government funds are directed at similar tasks. Israel's democracy is currently being propped up by its citizens. Jonathan, where do you see a similar disconnect between the public and the government, which could lead to protests?
I'm thinking about Einav Zangaukar, who is a powerful example of this disconnect. As the mother of Matan Zangaukar, a hostage, she has used her voice and full being as an activist for a hostage deal. The recognition of her forceful protest is global and reminds me of the Four Mothers protests of the late 1990s. The Four Mothers and those in that movement spoke directly to the impact of war on their children and asked the question directly about whether or not the war benefited the state. They used the media effectively and achieved their goal of withdrawal from Lebanon. If the disconnect between the public and government is strong enough, it can lead to a change in public opinion, leadership, and policy. Both Golda Meir and Menachem Begin resigned in the aftermath of public inquiry and mass protests. The Four Mothers protests ultimately brought about the withdrawal of the IDF from Lebanon. So Einav and other family members protesting to bring loved ones home could ultimately cause a shift in the negotiation dynamics. All of these stories raise the question of how citizen protests can affect change in a society without weakening the state to a moment of crisis. For you, our listeners, what are the protests that you feel compelled to go to and why? What is the difference between a solidarity gathering and a protest? Do you think Israel is a democracy in crisis, or more a young and unfinished state that is still being shaped? Is the crisis internal or external? And how might both aspects relate? What are the similarities and differences when we compare Israel's protests today to other protest movements of the past?
Yeah, compared to the US, for example, at 77 years of independence, in which civil war broke out to reconcile unresolved issues like slavery, economic policy, state versus federal freedoms and restrictions, we would say Israel is not at a crisis, especially not at a crisis of civil war. But it is at a major turning point in determining the future of the nation. It can be brought back from the precipice of internal strife if the government takes a more inclusive and compromising approach to some of the very diverse issues in society. As a young Jewish democracy in the making, there are many ways that the state could go off the rails and end up in crisis, such as, some of the ways we listed here. However, there are so many protesting citizens, public servants, elected officials, and judges who are acting to rein the state back into a place of mamlachtiyut, statism, with responsibility and accountability and care, so that the future of the state will be secure for the next several decades. To our listeners, please consider how you might play a role in securing Israel's Jewish democracy for years to come, and what you might protest for or against. Thank you for listening to Israeli Protests, Democracy in Action, or State in Crisis. Please visit our websites, heartstance.org and tgdconsulting.org, to download our family and educator guide with additional resources and discussion prompts.